All right. Hey, I am actually shaking up here, and both my PFP as well as me in person, I'm shaking up. I'm shaking pretty violently here, just considering who I'm sitting next to on this panel. Right? It could be the height as well, but it's a combination of those things for sure. But I am super thrilled to be joined by Jack Butcher. Right? Many of you know Jack. Recent sort of generative, PFP, artwork, design, aesthetic, sort of dynamic artwork, in the space. I mean, he has, what he has done with dynamic artworks and being able to send that message out to, his collector base with a daily sort of new perspective on art is something that I haven't seen in the space for a while, right? So excited to have Jack here. We have John Moore, who's an investor from TCG Crypto, an early stage consumer crypto company. So super excited to have John here join us as well. So welcome, John. Linda Adami, the founder and CEO of Quantum Temple, which is a history-backed, culture-preserving company that's actually putting, a lot of these historical assets from regions around the world that are underrepresented on the blockchain, right? So that culture can be preserved. So welcome, Linda. And last but not least, Snowfro, aka Eric Calderon, just an amazing individual, and the OG founder of Art Blocks, and in many ways generative art movement on Web3, right? So super excited to have him here. But really a very amazing panel, and I'd like the panel to kind of introduce themselves, starting with Jack, right? Jack, over to you.
All right. Thanks for having me, mate. Thank you for the introduction. I am a designer by trade. Sorry, my dog is just suddenly decided to start going nuts. Designer by trade. I worked in advertising for 10 years in New York and started my own agency business about 3 or 4 years ago, and basically was practicing art as a way to get clients for my agency up until I discovered this world and was actually able to make the transition from using art kind of as a lead magnet for agency business to practicing as an artist full time. And that's been the case for probably about the best part of a couple of years now. So absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to talking to everyone here.
Thank you, Jack. John, you're next.
Awesome. Yeah, very excited to be here as well. I've been investing in the crypto space for about 2.5 years now. We've done over 27 or so deals. We really try to pride ourselves on taking a really pragmatic approach to how crypto can enable net new experiences. And I think NFTs and digital identity are right in our sweet spot of why this space is so interesting. So really hyped to just be here amongst the legends, and excited to get into it.
Thank you, John. Linda.
Hey everyone, super excited to be here. It's a pleasure. A little bit about me. I've been living in emerging markets for the last 13 years, working at the intersection between public policy, economic development, and technology. I spent the last 7 years working specifically with the Dubai government, building the tech ecosystem since 2016. That's actually when I got introduced to blockchain, when we built the largest, at the time, public blockchain strategy to put 100% of government services on chain by 2020. And that led into all the recent crypto asset regulation in the formation of VARA and the ADGM Web3 funds, which has obviously gathered a lot of interest from the space, given everything that is going on in the US on the regulatory side as well. And during the pandemic, I also took some time off my 7-year public appointment, and then I essentially ventured east in Indonesia, which is where Quantum Temple started, and my journey in Web3 as well. Out of the realization on the ground of the dramatic impact that the lack of tourism when there was COVID obviously had on all of those economies that heavily rely on tourism as a source of revenue, and specifically the cultural heritage space, which I hope we'll get a little bit deeper on. And Quantum Tempo is now trying to use Web3 as a new way to preserve and transmit cultural heritage by unlocking new revenue streams for the communities that work and still practice these traditions today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. And Eric, last but not least.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me up here. Very proud to be here in front of all these dancing avatars. I'm just not sure how I make my dance, but I wanted to. I'm Eric, also known as Snowfro. Founded Artblocks in 2020. Been collecting CryptoPunks, autoglyphs, and Meebits since 2017, and amongst other things. And created a NFT project called the Krymo, which has far exceeded my expectations of reality. So yeah, thanks for having me again. Appreciate y'all.
Hey, thank you, Eric. So the topic for today is identity and NFTs, right? So, and if you think about identity and avatars traditionally outside of blockchain tech, they've mostly been reserved for gaming or for social swag on social media platforms, right? Whether it's LinkedIn or other sort of corporate sort of intranet environments, if you will. So when someone might flex their image in a suit or swag with a fancy title, right? But when you think about all of those elements, they're kind of ephemeral in a way. So that state exists in that app and is never permanent. But when you think about NFTs and the idea of being able to, have a, a provable, owned avatar with provenance, and with the advent of blockchain tech, we now have this concept of ownership, and the paradigm has been flipped, right? So the whole concept of portability now exists across environments, as long as the chain exists, of course, right? So Jack, I'm going to start with you, right? You've created checks in OPEPN more recently, and you've described PFPs as a beachfront property of our digital world, if you're evaluating on pure visibility alone, right? And I think one of the things you said is that it's a very limited filter that we use to create these assets today, right? Mostly anthropomorphic characters, and with some trait variation. But how do you look at OPEPN and what you're doing with OPEPN AI, and like pushing that sort of envelope into sort of different areas for people to think differently about what a PFP means, right? So maybe talk us through a little bit of that.
Thank you, mate. Yeah. So the first comment about the beachfront property basically comes from the attempt to make art circulate at scale. It's very difficult to keep your art on the feed or part of the network unless people are kind of going out of their way to share it, right? Downloading an image and then posting it, as opposed to just every time somebody is participating on the network, the image that they use to represent themselves is being circulated. So that was like always what interested me about this format, in terms of being able to make something that is everywhere. And actually went down the route of developing a couple of different projects back in 2021, where we're kind of using the mechanics that were out in the market, making a bunch of traits and then running an algorithm to generate 10,000 versions of a thing, and just never really felt like that true to the kind of work that I had been doing before. So none of them ever saw the light of day. Where there was a breakthrough more recently with this OPEPN project is this idea of constraints, which has always been a huge part of the work that I've done, setting these very strict boundaries that then kind of unlock this additional layer of creativity. So something like, which is displayed behind me, hopefully, this really simple set of geometric rules that can kind of be interpreted hundreds, thousands, millions of different ways, while consistently kind of adding equity to this geometry. So people recognize the geometry, and then the ability to put it through all these different aesthetic filters is like a way for people to create something that they really identify with. You can kind of layer on your aesthetic universe but also identify other people that share the set of beliefs or the values that, in my mind, this infrastructure is about, which is permissionless creativity, network building, you know, making art, and trying to solve the cold start problem by having this really simple set of rules that people can play with versus staring at a blank page.
I love that. And kind of building on that point, and I've seen some of, you know, the community activation, and it's been unlike anything I've seen for a long time, right? What is the role of community memetics within identity as far as you can see?
So I think this idea of like whether you are making the meaning or the meaning is being collectively built, that's really the difference in my mind, is like how much input do you need, or how many, like what do you provide that can be built on top of? And if you can, I mean, this remains to be seen over a long period of time, but my thesis is if you can make a canvas that can be like remixed, adapted, you know, collaborated on, built upon, then people feel a greater sense of ownership or identify more with that symbol, with other people that are playing around with that symbol. And that's not really the end goal. It's more of a, like, it becomes this magnet for identifying people that you want to spend more time with, that you might want to build things with. It's just like this conduit that you get past just identifying with an image. You're kind of expressing your desire to make things, to be creative, to understand more about these set of technologies. So I think if you can make something that invites participation like that, the second and third order effects can be much greater than just, hey, I collected this picture because I think it's cool, or there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's a different dynamic when you're bringing people into something where they can produce a part of it, and there are no aesthetic restrictions on how to participate. Like if you wanted to remix, you know, a very specific PFP collection, you have to have a very specific, not necessarily you have to, but you have to identify with a very specific aesthetic. So what we're attempting to do with this is like transcend the individual aesthetic and get to like this symbol that can be remixed basically infinitely.
Got it. I love that. So I want to pull on that thread a bit more. As a designer, what are the key elements that you considered, right, when creating visual narratives for identity in the NFT space, right? I see like the concept of memetics and culture obviously interwoven in a lot of your work, but are there some sort of key patterns as a designer, as you sort of think about the Web3 space, that allow for that breakthrough and that adoption that, you know, many people struggle with, right? But like you do a great job of, you know, having the community meme, but what are the concepts that you sort of, you know, put into play when you try to think about that blank canvas?
Well, I think constraint is definitely one, is like, if you can, like the process of design in itself, I think is about constraint or reduction, or, you know, saying as much as you can with as little as possible. So that's one piece. And then maybe the second is going back to the last answer, basically, like the ways in which something could be remixed or reinterpreted feel like table stakes if you're trying to build something that can replicate by itself. Otherwise, it just has this shelf life that when that aesthetic ages out, or when, you know, the group of people who I initially identified with that aesthetic are, you know, move on to something else or are distracted by something else, the momentum behind the idea kind of wanes. So trying to, I guess there's like a barbell way to interpret this too. You either pick an aesthetic that is like completely timeless, or you make something that is so dynamic and can evolve so frequently that it's always like, it's like timely versus timeless. And that, hopefully that's kind of the yin and yang between Chex and Opepa. And it's like this one symbol is kind of, has so much cultural equity that everybody has a relationship to it and understands something about it, and you don't have to embellish it really, versus it's kind of poking fun at the idea of like on the Pepin side is like we've like identified ourselves as, I don't know, unicorns or llamas or whatever the set of anthropomorphic things that have like played the last couple of years, and try to get to a place where the symbol represents like the values of the space, and you can have your own take on that and add your own aesthetic to it, remix it, etc.
Got it. Now, speaking of that, how do you think NFTs can contribute to a more inclusive digital society?
I mean, I think personally what I saw as a response to checks more specifically in the original sense was like you can kind of draft off of the mimetic or economic energy of something and contribute to it and grow your network as a function of that, maybe sell some work as a function of that, maybe like redirect some energy to your more original work by contributing to some bigger meme. So the idea of, I mean, I guess the idea of this being an economic layer versus a social layer is the like the primary reason why I believe there's more, like the ability to do that is greater, but there are also obviously power laws, network effects, things of that nature happening in this space as they happen everywhere else. So I definitely don't subscribe to the you know, by default participating in this is like you get some utopian result, but it feels like plugging into this economic network gives you a better sense of truth in inverted commas. Like one analogy I always use was like more people bought an open edition of checks than liked checks, like the checks image on Twitter. So there's this like weird contrast there or paradox there that I wouldn't have thought that would be the case, but there's something about the connectedness of Ethereum and the economic signals that are moving around that feel to me like closer to the truth, and understanding that network and being like plugged into how people read that network and learning to read it yourself, to me is like you're just closer to the economic energy. I guess that's how I would think about it.
Super helpful, Jack. It's kind of funny. I did a poll probably about a month ago, right? And it was just to sort of validate from the community what I was seeing on Twitter more broadly. And I asked the participants on Twitter, what would be more mimetically relevant 10 years from now? And I think the options I gave them were Pepes, CryptoPunks, checks, and nouns. And the shocking thing to me was, you know, of course, Pepe's won, right? I mean, Pepe's carried the day, but it was a very close second place between checks and CryptoPunks. And I thought that was kind of shocking, right? I mean, it was amazing to me. That means that you've somehow transcended, and perhaps it's the lack of the anthropomorphic, you know, character, template that people have seen, to something that's a little bit more neutral and a design aesthetic, if you will. It's almost like, you know, Snowfro squiggles, right? I mean, you see so many people using Snowfro squiggles as the PFP, and it's kind of an interesting sort of outcome from that Twitter response, but very cool.
Love it.
With that, I want to transition over to Eric now. So Eric, obviously you've been a maven in the space, and you've really put generative art on Web3 on the map with art blocks. But what inspired you, right, to create art blocks?
Art blocks is kind of the thing that happened from many years of exploring both physical and digital art, and then going down the deep rabbit hole of blockchain technology in 2017, and a desire to create something because what I wanted didn't exist in the world, and then thinking, well, if I want it, maybe somebody else wants it too, for how to release stuff. And it really, I think I've said this in the past a couple of times, but like I have a really good friend of mine. His name is Pete. He goes by Pixel Pete in the space. And I don't know, maybe like the 25th product or idea or entrepreneurship endeavor that I had or had done, and it didn't really go as planned. And he looked at me, he's like, hey man, all these things are eventually going to come together into one pretty big thing. And I remember that because it was kind of it was just a moment where I was like, I don't know how to describe what it is to be an entrepreneur, but you have all these ideas and you really had to kind of like filter them out. And of the maybe 10 entrepreneurial endeavors that I've actually executed on, there's like 100 for every single one of those. And a lot of people in my life have supported all these crazy ideas, listening to them, rolling them rise. And yeah, the way that Artblocks came together was literally just like a very clear, a moment of clarity that combined, I was claiming CryptoPunks and realized that why could I selfishly pick all the zombies? Like why, and again, if I didn't, somebody else would have, so I don't feel guilty, but I got to pick all the zombies that were left because that's how you claimed CryptoPunks. And I thought, well, the smart contract could be making that decision more equitable for me. And, I've been making art with code for a long time. And I do feel like that is an art form that has generally been undervalued. And when I was making art with code, it wasn't what you see as generative art today. It was actually more of like immersive art. I was using, more kind of arcane techniques like projection mapping, which today is a little bit more common. But back when I was doing it, it was a little bit less, just less easy to kind of get into. And it just felt like there wasn't really a great way to reward people that make art with code for their passion in the hobby that they put into it. And what I would do is I would spend 8 hours setting up a 3-dimensional surface to project light onto, and then it would be for a musician for an hour. And then after that, I would take it down. It'd take me 2 hours to take it down. And, it was very rewarding for me. And it felt like it was really nice to be able to put my stuff out there. But I felt like there was like a hole there, like a gap there for people that were creating things using technology. And I don't know, I kind of felt like I wanted to fill it. And so once I learned about NFTs, or just more importantly, because I feel like the word NFT has just kind of gotten to this point of overuse, but once I learned about the ability to prove ownership of a digital asset, and to be able to reward creators that make digital things, that combined with a desire to be able to put art on chain and to automate processes like what you see in Artblocks, I literally stumbled into it, and then once I did, it clicked, and I was like, yeah, I think this is gonna be really big. And I spent 2 years developing it, and it didn't really go anywhere. And then I gave up, and then it just kind of came back one day. I was like, no, this is something that I think can have value, and so I did, and launched it finally in 2020, and here we are today.
Yeah, thankfully you did, Eric. Great story. And by the way, I love how you wove zombies into the story, right? Because when I look at your Twitter profile, I remember that you've always had this ode out to Larva Labs, right? For lighting the fuse, I think you call it.
Yeah.
And as you link that back to generative art, how does that help individuals express their identity in your mind?
Well, I think that's what's so powerful about generative art, or it doesn't have to be generative art, like the concept of 1 of 1 of X. And to me, the way I define the concept of 1 of X is that you are able to own something that's individual and unique to you, that is clearly part of a larger family. And, that is based on feelings of inclusivity and wanting to feel like you're part of something, or feel like you're part of a larger group. It is not something that I was able to draw a direct connection to when I started thinking of Artblocks. I mean, I didn't put my zombie as my PFP for at least a year or two after I claimed them in 2017. I didn't even make the connection. My PFP was one of my old sculptures that I had made a long time ago. Back then, everything was kind of more pseudo-anonymous, so like there was just less of a direct link. What I realized though, because when I questioned myself, especially once, before starting Artblocks, nobody was asking me questions. In fact, the only people I was talking to was in Discord. So IRL, like deep, meaningful conversations about kind of where we are and how we got here, weren't really happening. I spent a lot of time just helping people learn how to use a wallet and explaining to them why these pixelated characters were worth $200. I mean, that was kind of like the average price point at which the most people came in, and the most explaining that I had to do is to, like, why are people, people would be like, who is stupid enough to pay $200 for this thing? And so then I'd be like, okay, let's talk about this. It wasn't until Artblock started and I get, people started asking meaningful questions about kind of like my background and my career, that I realized that I claimed CryptoPunks because it's a generative artwork, because it was something that I'm fascinated by, the fact that Larva Lab did not make 10,000 characters individually placing each pixel, and instead created 10,000 characters with some lines of code. I'm fascinated by the fact that there's no way that they could have, in a feasible way, distributed 10,000 characters individually in processes that existed before the way blockchain does it today. But because of blockchain, because of the generative aspects, we've unlocked something that is completely revolutionary here. And it is a way that individuals can be individualistic owners of something that's clearly part of a larger group. And as you see all the PFPs out there, and like all the PFPs on people's helmets, or on their screens and on Twitter, you realize how important it is for people to belong to something like that. And I just remember there was like the beginning of the editions, right? So when I first started dealing with NFTs, it was CryptoPunks, which obviously is a 101x project, but there was also stuff that was being released on Known Origin and Super Rare, and oftentimes those would be like editions of 5, maybe 10. But every now and then you'd see 2 people with the same PFP. And I remember thinking, gosh, like, there are so many options out there. And I'm not dogging anybody that did that. They were very proud that they owned that artwork, even if it was 2018. Like, that's freaking awesome. But like, I just kept thinking, like, there's so many options for what you could be having as like the thing that represents you in this very noisy digital space that was Discord in 2018, which is like less than 1% of what it is today, right? And thinking, like, people need to have access to this thing that makes them individuals. And it's also important to note that your face is the most individual thing that you have, but this is a pseudo-anonymous space. And so people don't want to put their face on there. And to this day, when you see people put their face on their Twitter profile, it just looks different than everybody else's, cartoon characters, which is just like a really fascinating thing. But I think this technology enables us to reach a broader audience. And I don't think that was the original intention of the blockchain, but that is certainly what it has, what intrigued me, and certainly what has happened in the last 2 years for me, specifically for my team and my family and all the people that are involved in what Artblocks is doing. I mean, it's just, we have somehow managed to do a thing that reaches a lot of people and enables artists to reach a lot of people and participate in dialogue well outside of what would have been normally feasible without the technology. So it's a really beautiful thing. I'm excited that even in a bear market, like, we still get to talk about this, because that hasn't changed. That value proposition of why we're here has not changed, and it will never change unless somehow it's illegal to interact with the Ethereum blockchain in the United States, which would be a really sad thing.
I hear you, Eric. There's a lot of I'm sure there's a lot of angst out there with some of the recent sort of rules and regs that we're starting to see. At least the messaging has not been great. With the advent of tech like AI now, and AI really sort of capturing the mainstream sort of consciousness, how do you see the future of generative art and its role in shaping identity, digital identity, if you will?
I think it's already been shown by CryptoPunks, but there's a fine line with. I've kind of been sharing a little bit of thoughts on this lately with the concept of 101 of X in general, where I do believe people want to belong to a larger family, but there's a fine line where, like, there's so much variability in an output of a project that it becomes hard to identify within a specific community unless you are in that community and you understand exactly what you're looking at. So there's some projects, and I absolutely did not intentionally do this with the Krymo squiggle, but there's some projects that can stand out as specifically clearly being that project, but when you zoom in and you realize that it is an individual output, and that's been demonstrated through kind of like the amount of people that use the Krymo squiggle as a PFP, even though it's not a typical face, which is typically what we see as a PFP. I think that that will translate into the real world. I think that eventually you'll get to a point where you're going to be interested in physical objects that you own also being individualized and representing you individually. But generative art enables someone to do that at scale. And I think the opposite of it, and something I've really had the pleasure of getting to know a really wonderful human named Sam Spratt lately, who if you zoom out and you don't know anything about it, you could say that if you don't see the intricate detail of what he's doing, that those Lucy skulls are like a generative edition of 50, or I think it's 50, maybe 100, and that those were each meticulously handmade and hand carved, and his community is of that count. And he may not be interested in having a community of people that's bigger than that. And those people feel like they're part of a smaller family and a more kind of like intimate conversation, which I, in some cases, would also really enjoy having, and in some cases have projects that are smaller than that. What generative art enables is for that to be just like blown out of proportion, and to be able to have a much broader conversation. And I think it's just important to note that not everybody wants that, and not everybody needs that in their life. I didn't think that I wanted it or needed it in my life, to be fair, when I launched the Krymo Squiggle. I've definitely enjoyed it very much. I've enjoyed having a voice in a broader ecosystem. I've enjoyed having a platform to share my ideas and thoughts about all of the things, whether it's creator royalties or just whatever the hot topic is of the day. And I think that me having created something that can be a PFP for a larger group of people and can be represented by a larger group of people has given me a voice that's larger than I thought I would ever have. And so it's just one of the tools that we have as people to, kind of knit together like-minded individuals. The last thing I would say is that, in New York last week, I think I made 75 friendship bracelets with people that came on stage at the Samsung event. And the experience was pretty mind-blowing for me, just to like it was almost like speed dating 75 individuals. But there's something really powerful about having a dialogue with these individuals one at a time as they approach the stage, each of them with their own unique bracelet, with their own unique story that they bring to the table. Like it's ground zero is the PFP. Ground zero is the generative artwork. That is literally the very, very beginning of it, and everything that comes after that is what is for you, the creator, the audience, the collector, to kind of piece together and get excited about over time.
I love it, Eric. So really, identity and the NFT and the PFP is the base layer, layer zero. Love that. Love that. All right, I'm going to transition over to Linda. Linda, now we've spoken about identity and we've spoken about NFTs from the perspective of identity in the metaverse in Web3. But what you're doing is something very different, right? What you're doing is, ensuring the preservation of historical assets by, effectively creating, skeuomorphic models of those objects, whether in 3D or other, plus culture and, cultural heritage in general on the blockchain. But maybe tell us about how Quantum Temple helps users connect with their historical and cultural identity, right?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So yeah, Quantum Temple, like as I was mentioning earlier, was really came out of my travels in Indonesia during the pandemic, when I became very immersed into this ecosystem and trying to understand the challenges that it was going through, right? So just maybe before I get into like how Quantum Temple works, like for people that maybe are not familiar with what we mean by cultural heritage, the UNESCO defines cultural heritage twofold, with a tangible and intangible cultural heritage. So tangible, think of like monuments, or it could be also a ceremonial or decorative artifact, anything that you can feel and touch. And then intangible would be everything that is essentially immaterial, right? Such as like music, dance, knowledge, even like farming is actually a form of intangible cultural heritage, specifically traditional cultural knowledge, for example. And so all of that is what a lot of obviously communities around the world still practice according to their ancestral traditions. For some of them is also a very important source of income. So many people, cultural heritage is a very important contributor to to jobs. So is actually estimated to be the second largest employer in the developing world, just after agriculture, mostly young women in under 35 in rural areas. And even within the tourism context, right? Like the way all of us probably have experienced cultural heritage is through travel, right? Like probably 1 in 2 is reported to travel around the world to experience a different culture. And so in fact, cultural tourism represents roughly like 40% of total travel. So total travel is like $10 trillion industry. Cultural tourism is 40% of that. So it's very significant. But there's like there's a very deep kind of like value concentration that happens there, where it is estimated that every $100 that are spent on a tour holiday, only $5 stay in that country when that country is a developing country, right? So that's like the root cause of like why, despite the fact that there's still obviously like a lot of communities preserving heritage, like there's a fundamental financial misalignment and kind of negative incentive model for the younger generation to continue to custode this. So as I was in Bali and experienced it, then even further, the lack of tourism. So basically there was no source of revenue. All of the communities on the ground had to default back to farming to provide for themselves. So we were thinking about alternative resilience model, distribution models that were not tied to physical tourism to provide for these communities. And that's when we started seeing the explosion of NFTs in the context of art with digital artists, and we started thinking, well, actually, like tokenization can provide enormous value for cultural heritage at large. And I'm happy to give some other really interesting use cases. But fundamentally, the way in which Quantum Temple works is that we have created our own native platform where audiences, community members from around the world can now have a new way to experience cultural heritage and connect to the custodians of these cultures by experiencing these assets that are being tokenized, as you said, in different format, whether it's through 3D or right now we're using in our first draft, for example, we used the ethnographic filmmaking, and we worked our first pilot, for example, has been based in the island of Bali in Indonesia, and we worked with 11 different communities. This amazing filmmaking team, and Professor Steve Lansing, who's a renowned cultural anthropologist who has spent almost like half a century in Bali to curate the first collection and explain how we can actually tokenize these tangible and intangible assets on chain to preserve and create an archival, an immutable decentralized records of this knowledge that will be available for posterity, but then using also the transparency of smart contracts to distribute the value, to distribute value directly in the hands of the communities that we're working with. So we, in fact, out of those 11 communities that we work with, we onboarded them onto their first wallet to show that end-to-end transparency can actually happen. And in fact, when those NFTs are sold, the royalties trickle down directly downstream to the end of these amazing custodians of traditions that we're trying to empower.
Thanks, Linda. That's great. I mean, 5% was the default. So it's great that you are really focusing on how more of that, that tourism dollar actually goes to the individuals in those countries. I'm curious, right? I guess dealing with tourism in general, there's a lot of politics at play in many of these countries that you have to deal with. How do you go about brokering the partnerships in a way that allow these countries to cooperate and collaborate and share their cultural artifacts, right? Especially considering that the blockchain may be, it's a global blockchain and they may have less control. Right. How do you broker that, right? I'm sure there's a lot that goes into it. Totally.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there's actually two processes. We go bottom up and top down. Bottom up is very important. A lot of people ask us, like, how do you guys, partner with communities on the ground. What does that process entail? It is called, we abide to something that is called free, prior, and informed consent, which is established by UNESCO to specifically, as an ethical framework that guide us as to how do we engage with especially traditional and indigenous communities. So even before theorizing, how do we go about tokenize, because a lot of this, cultural heritage, if it's not managed, let's say, by the local institutions, it is managed and owned most likely by local traditional communities, right? So we need to be extremely cautious. It's very sensitive as to how do we approach them, and also like how do we integrate and how do we what's the right word, introduce this new technology, which is obviously new for most people, even in the Western world, like let alone for a lot of these countries that would be the last in line to be a part of this, right? So that's on the bottom up side. On the top down, as you said, like we work with institutions, mostly is like ministries of tourism and culture, and it might be counterintuitive, but actually we have found incredible openness and adoption to the integration of blockchain in the space. Last year we talked to like more than like 20 tourism board, ministries of tourism, ministries of culture and creative economy from all parts of the world. And all of them actually were, I would say most of them rather, like were aware of Web3, of like blockchain and NFTs. Like they knew that this technology could fundamentally disrupt in a positive way, provide value, in fact, restore those kind of value concentration, lack of financialization of cultural assets. And so we're trying to figure out how to integrate, right? And like when we knocked their door, they suddenly realized that this was, a great opportunity to be a part of it. And in fact, now we've been working with the Ministry of Tourism and Creative Economy of Indonesia very, very closely. But also in LATAM with the governments of Panama, Peru, and also Thailand and Palau and other countries also in East Asia. And so all of them, again, they've been incredibly open to be a part of this, but they just didn't know how, right? And I think fundamentally for the space is quite interesting. Actually, what's happening in Indonesia, like that we can talk a little bit more, is that what I'm learning is that by starting to introduce this use case through heritage, through tourism, it's almost like a way to build that trust, that this technology is not like speculation, we're not just here to make a financial gain, right? And I think, and what we're seeing, for example, in the case of Indonesia, like now they're interested to expand this into like other industry sectors. They're interested in like thinking about, positive regulation in their own countries to grow the ecosystem locally. And I think for us, this gives us a lot of confidence, but also like a lot of hope for also the other ecosystem player that can integrate.
Thank you, Linda. Super helpful. All right, I'm going to move on to John now. So John, being an investor in early stage consumer crypto companies, how do you see the first wave of social apps having influenced the expression of identity?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fascinating question, because in my opinion, like Web2 social apps are probably some of the most compelling, interesting examples of how technology can kind of shape our behavior. And I think, social apps have empowered the long tail. They've given like small niche audiences global distribution and kind of redefined belonging. I think someone mentioned it on the panel earlier, but I might only come across so many people day to day in real life, but my one profile picture or post can come across, billions of people at the same time, and at different times throughout the day, right? So I think, we've all heard of the concept of 1,000 true fans, but I think the internet's kind of shown us that there's, even if you're only staying with this core 1,000, you now have a new opportunity to engage. And I think it's redefined how much we're willing to, put online and all the different ways we can participate. I think, I love kind of Jack's framework around constraints really increasing creativity. And I think the ability to, push each other to share more and do more on social apps, within certain constraints on certain platforms like Instagram or Twitter. I think it's really kind of redefined and shaped, a new generation and a new aspect of how we can participate. And I think that's like, a lot. I think that's just a great example of technology furthering our relationships in ways we haven't seen before. So definitely very, very excited about kind of this first wave today.
Thanks, John. To build on that, what do you think is driving that shift towards, sharing more digital life experiences, if you will, in social, right? There seems to be a huge trend over the last 5 or 10 years, but what do you think is really propelling that?
I mean, it's an interesting question because I think there's like macro dynamic and micro. Like, macro, we obviously saw a shift during the pandemic when people couldn't be together as much, how social apps could give us a sense of belonging and connectivity, be in like that we just didn't see possible before, right? We're like watching movies together and doing different things like that together. I think there's also just the like saturation of mobile. Like we can now that I have a phone that actually has like a high touch screen, with like good connectivity anywhere around the world, like I'm much more willing to engage and do stuff online and participate and take risks because I know I'll be able to connect and get the information I want and get the, some of the engagement I like. And I think a lot of this comes back to like human psychology and like the concept of kind of like a dopamine feedback loop that continues to push us to want to do more and participate. So I think the shift is like macro and micro, and we're also seeing it with new businesses online, right? Like my mom has been working with little kids for like 20 years, and all of them today want to be influencers when they grow up, and I think that's a direct new opportunity. That's a result of people having more of a digital life and identity that they didn't have before.
That's pretty interesting. The social influencer as like a future job, a job category in itself is just scary. It's scary to think of.
Yeah. Well, who knows how sustainable it is at this point. And I think it's fascinating for me because it's going to push us, I think, as an industry, especially around like the importance of like, immutable tech and how we think about end-to-end provenance that maybe we can only access through crypto. But I think it's really going to push us around like how we monetize things in a sustainable way. And I think that's like a really cool example of why NFTs, while a lot of people thought they were just initially, use a cool way to think about like a net new revenue line and like a net new way to monetize, we can kind of push this to think about like it goes from social to social economic. And now it's like, it's not just revenue, right? We can think about distribution, we can think about acquisition, we can think about so many different things. And I think the innovation around business models for NFTs for people who are, PFP collectors or 10-year-olds who want to be influencers in the future, I think you could play a really, really fascinating role in how we have sustainable ways to reward people for what they're doing online.
Makes sense. Can you share an example of a social app that has, in your mind, successfully integrated NFTs right into the core of what they do as an expression of identity? Has anybody done it well?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to show my bags, but but I think one really cool example is a company we invested in called Medallion. Medallion's creating fan clubs for musicians on chain. And they're working with really cool artists like My Morning Jacket and Tycho to kind of launch new Web3 campaigns. And the overarching goal for someone like Medallion is to serve as this on-ramp for music fans into Web3 and remove gatekeepers and empower artists and really like launch cool decentralized communities. And I think it's really, really interesting for identity, because while there's still new ways we're, I think, innovating on the PFP side of things, people, especially those who are super fans, have like, they really want a more intimate relationship with their artists. And like Medallion specifically enables that in ways where you might know that like your past Medallion, right, is this NFT, and like you can sign up for the platform using your wallet or just using an email address, and you might not know it, but that NFT is your, like your past that enables you to really see all these benefits around, it's digital goods, or, you don't have to wait in the same Ticketmaster line, right? You have exclusive access there. Just having a much closer one-to-one connection. And I think it's a cool example of NFTs like transforming digital identity from purely a social relationship, like I mentioned, to that socioeconomic dynamic where your identity as that super fan is expanding what you kind of could ever think of before. And because we have, right, this blockchain, and I know it's who you are. I know for a fact, right, I'm dealing with Tycho. My sense is someone's identity, they're willing to take more risks and do stuff online, almost as if, Tycho was in the room with them right here. Because this NFT guarantees, like, on both sides, kind of what we're doing. So I think it's a really cool example of how we're pushing NFTs for identity outside of just the visual, which I think is like there's just so many different buckets of innovation in this space. And so that's just I think that's just one, cool one that I think, I think some of their data is really, really interesting, because they're seeing, 8% more fans than Facebook, 40% more fans than Reddit, 3 times more fans than Discord. And I think a large part of that is just the guarantee and the intimacy that you only can really get through the provenance secured through this NFT.
Yeah. So on that concept of provenance, right? So with the advent of mass market consumer AI, what challenges do you see in creating social apps that actually cater to sharing digital life experiences, right? Looks like there's a whole vector of very scary stuff that can happen here. What's your perspective there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. Like we've been talking, I mean, everyone I'm sure has been talking nonstop about GPT and everything, and like kind of what impacts that might have outside of the short term, but like especially in the long term when we think about AGI, and how the barrier of it, like to create might be reduced, like what really matters now. I think some of the challenges are definitely going to be around like go to market and how we think about scale. I also think it's going to impact the business models, because I think, there's going to be more of a premium on taste and curation, and really thinking about like the attribution of who created what, and how did they adjust what. And I think it's gonna be really, really interesting, and it'll be for sure a challenge how we think about really maintaining authentic relationships with all this new content, new IP. And so I think social apps going forward, I think will really benefit, in my opinion, from like taking like a more vertical specific approach, instead of just trying to like incentivize people and like bring in everyone at one time. I think it's really cool to think about constraints, think about ways you can solve a specific pain point for a community, that wasn't possible before. So I think the space will evolve a lot, and I think we're only in the first inning.
Got it. I love how you kind of knitted together the answer and tied back to Jack's opening missive on constraints. But really, really great panel, guys. Really appreciate all of you being here today. Any final questions from each of you to the other panelists that you may want to pose in the last couple of minutes that we have here?
Are you guys ready for the next 2 to 5 years in this space? Because I have no idea what to expect, but we're in it for the long haul, y'all, and there's gonna be a lot to do and a lot to navigate, and just kind of curious where people's minds are at. But I also am late to a call, so maybe I shouldn't have asked such a deep question.
No, Eric, I love the question, right? I'll tell you, I'm very optimistic and bullish because of the folks that are on this panel, right? The 4 of you, and what you are bringing to the space and the leadership that we have. I think that is a super bullish for the space, because It's about growing smartly. It's not about the FOMO. And you all embody that, right, in each of your areas. And I think that's super important for more people to learn as we scale and bring the next, 1 million, 10 million, 50 million people from my perspective. All right. With that, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you all joining the panel today. And to all of the community members who are out there, who are actually laying down and either dead or sitting in posture there or just dancing around. I saw like this thread guy running around before. There he is. There he or she is. Really appreciate all of you joining us. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, oncyber, for hosting this. This is beautiful. The audio is amazing. The videos are incredible. Y'all are killing it. Thank you so much.
Crushed it. Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.